Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The one who called himself Lord Voldemort never fought alone. Behind him always stood those who wore masks, hoods, and the dark mark on their arms, the Death Eaters. Bellatrix Lestrange, Barty Crouch Jr., Lucius Malfoy. These names are familiar to every Harry Potter fan. And like many others, you've probably wondered, how did this dark organization operate? What did its members sacrifice? And what unwritten rules were they forced to follow? Becoming a Death Eater wasn't just about joining an elite club of dark wizards. It was a path paved with fear, submission, and blood. Let's explore the commandments the Dark Lord demanded from his followers. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Absolute obedience to orders, the most crucial rule, the one that determined whether a Death Eater lived or died. Never ask questions. If the Dark Lord commands, obey, even if it sounds strange, senseless, or suicidal. Bellatrix Lestrange, fanatically loyal to Voldemort, didn't even ask what she was hiding in the Gringotts vault. She simply did it. But Lucius Malfoy hesitated when Voldemort demanded his wand and was immediately put in his place. His wife, Narcissa, knew full well what a delay could cost and rushed to intervene. Number 2. Never speak Voldemort's name. To ordinary wizards, he was he who must not be named. To the Death Eaters, the Dark Lord or the Master. It wasn't just about respect, it was about reverence. Even Severus Snape, playing the dangerous game of a double agent, always strictly followed this rule. None of the Death Eaters dared whisper Voldemort's real name, Tom Riddle. It was considered blasphemy, and anyone who disobeyed could pay dearly for it. Number 3. Eliminate those who reject Voldemort's ideology. The Dark Lord allowed no neutrality. You were either with him or against him. This applied to everyone, Muggles, Muggleborns, half-bloods, Aurors, and even your own family. If a Death Eater's relatives refused to embrace the new ideology, they became targets. Loyalty had to be proven, even if it meant betraying one's blood. Any sign of weakness was seen as treason. Number 4. Infiltrate the Ministry of Magic. Voldemort's plan wasn't just to conquer the world, he wanted to control it from the inside. To do that, Death Eaters were tasked with infiltrating the Ministry of Magic. Slowly at first, using power, wealth, and influence. Then to a swift and precise takeover. Once a puppet minister was in place, figures like Yaxley took over key departments to solidify the new regime. These weren't just warriors, they were strategists, bureaucrats, and ideologists of terror. Number 5. Send children to Hogwarts. Paradoxically, Hogwarts, the stronghold of good, was seen by Voldemort as a vital educational tool. Despite his hatred for its teachers and headmaster, he respected the school's power. That's why Death Eaters sent their children there, even when they themselves were in hiding. Hogwarts wasn't just a school, it became a breeding ground for future Death Eaters. If a child followed in their parents' footsteps, they were the perfect recruit. Number 6. Initiate their children into the organization. Death Eater ideology wasn't meant to die with one generation. Parents pulled their children in. Draco Malfoy was given the task of killing Dumbledore, not just a mission, but a ritual of initiation. Crabbe and Goyle followed similar paths. When Hogwarts fell, the school turned into a greenhouse for Voldemort's ideology. The teachers were replaced with his loyalists, preparing a new generation of fanatical warriors. Number 7. Wear dark clothing. Color mattered. Black, dark green, dark blue. This was the palette of the Death Eaters. Bright colors were seen as weak and unserious. Voldemort himself wore long, flowing black robes that emphasized his regal aura. His followers wore heavy, grim uniforms, not just clothing, but a part of the fearsome image they projected. Together, they formed one chilling, unified force. Number 8. Never doubt blood purity. Bellatrix Lestrange spat the word like poison. Mudblood. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of belief. To her, and to every true Death Eater, magical blood was sacred. Muggle-borns were seen as intruders, stealing magic they didn't deserve. Even half-bloods like Snape had to prove themselves 10 times over. He never spoke of his Muggle father. He buried that shame deep. His silence was loyalty. His hatred was proof. Voldemort tolerated Snape's blood only because Snape never questioned the doctrine. When Voldemort learned of Harry's protection through Lily's sacrifice, he sneered. "She need not have died," he told Harry, dismissing her as a foolish mudblood. In his mind, her blood was worthless. Only power mattered, and power came from legacy. That's why families like the Malfoys, the Lestranges, and the Carrows held such high rank. Their bloodlines were clean, untouched. A Death Eater didn't just serve Voldemort with a wand. He served him with lineage, with pride, and with an unshakable belief that magic belonged only to the chosen. Number 9. The Dark Mark is mandatory. The Dark Mark burned. That was how they knew he was calling. Lucius Malfoy once said nothing as the mark on his arm flared during a meeting. He simply stood and left. That was the rule. No questions, no hesitation. The mark, a skull with a serpent tongue, was more than ink. It pulsed with dark magic, alive under the skin. When Voldemort returned in the graveyard, he pressed his finger to Wormtail's mark. Seconds later, the others began to appear. "Do you know why I have called you?" he asked coldly. None dared speak. The mark wasn't a badge, it was a chain. Some tried to hide it. Karkaroff showed his, trembling. "It's getting clearer, stronger," he whispered. He had once begged for freedom, trading names for his life. But the mark never faded. And when Voldemort rose again, it sealed his fate. His body was later found, frozen and lifeless. No trial, no forgiveness. The mark was forever. And any attempt to deny it was punished the only way Voldemort understood, with death. Number 10. Always have spies among enemies. Barty Crouch Jr. lived in plain sight. Disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, he walked the halls of Hogwarts, he taught Harry Potter, he guided students, and all the while he was working for Voldemort. "I gave you fair warning," he growled at Harry, moments before revealing the truth. For nearly a year, no one suspected. That was the perfection Voldemort demanded. A Death Eater must not only wear the enemy's colours, he must speak their language, eat at their table, and poison them from within. Severus Snape played a longer, deadlier game. Dumbledore trusted him. The Order relied on him. But Snape answered only to the Dark Lord. "You are a good and faithful servant, Severus," Voldemort once said. No higher praise existed. Snape moved between two worlds like a ghost, trusted by both, loyal to one. His ability to deceive was his power, his knowledge, his weapon. And though the truth was more complex, to Voldemort he was the perfect spy, silent, skilled, and deadly. Spies weren't a luxury, they were the foundation. While others fought in the open, the true victories happened in whispers. Voldemort knew where Harry was, who guarded him when he would move, because someone always spoke. Even Pius Thickness, once a high-ranking ministry official, was placed under the Imperious curse to serve the cause. He didn't scream or cast spells. He signed papers, gave orders, shifted the tide of war without lifting a wand. Voldemort didn't just conquer with fear, he conquered with information. Number 11. Respect snakes and serpent symbolism. Nagini wasn't just Voldemort's companion, she was part of him. She moved with him, watched with him, killed for him. When Charity Burbage begged for her life, pleading, "Please, Severus, please," Voldemort simply turned to Nagini and whispered, "Dinner." The act wasn't just execution, it was a ritual, death by snake, witnessed in silence by every Death Eater present. None of them flinched. None of them dared to look away, because Nagini wasn't an animal. She was sacred, a living extension of the Dark Lord's will, and to disrespect her, even by accident, was a threat to your own life. The serpent had always been Voldemort's symbol. The dark mark on every Death Eater's arm wasn't a skull alone, it was a snake slithering from its mouth. That image wasn't random. It was prophecy. It was identity. Voldemort spoke Parseltongue, the language of snakes, something most feared and few understood. The more a Death Eater embraced the serpent, the closer they were to power. Bellatrix wore silver snake rings. Lucius carried a cane with a serpent's head. Even the Chamber of Secrets, which Voldemort once opened as a boy, was shaped in the coils of a giant basilisk. Snakes were everywhere because they were everything. To mock the snake was to mock Voldemort. Once, a low-ranking Death Eater made a careless remark about Nagini, calling her just a pet. No one remembers his name now. Voldemort made sure of that. His punishment was swift and final. "She is more loyal than you," Voldemort said before snapping the man's wand. The room went cold. From that day on, even whispers about Nagini were coated in reverence. Every follower learned the lesson. To serve Voldemort was to worship the serpent, with fear, with silence, and with absolute devotion. Number 12. Show no sympathy for the enemy. Draco Malfoy stood on the astronomy tower, his wand shaking. Dumbledore, unarmed and frail, waited in silence. "Draco," he said softly, "you are not a killer." And he wasn't. That night proved it. Draco hesitated not because he was weak in magic, but because he felt. He saw the man, not just the target. Voldemort didn't need wizards who felt. He needed executioners. In that moment, Draco failed. Not just the mission, but the ideology. Compassion, even a flicker, was poison in the ranks. Voldemort spared Draco only because Snape stepped in. But the shame followed him. In Voldemort's eyes, mercy was treason. Severus Snape understood the rule better than anyone. His entire life was a performance of coldness. When he stood in the headmaster's office and watched Dumbledore collapse, it was not pity that stayed his hand, it was strategy. And even that was dangerous. Snape had once begged Voldemort to spare Lily Potter. "I have heard the request," Voldemort answered, annoyed. The mere act of asking for mercy had cost Snape his dignity. From that day forward, he learned to bury every trace of feeling. When Bellatrix questioned his loyalty, he didn't protest with emotion, he spoke with calculation, because to care is to expose, and exposure leads to death. Bellatrix Lestrange was the ideal, cold, cruel, and incapable of sympathy. When she tortured Hermione at Malfoy Manor, there was no doubt in her heart, no flicker of hesitation. "You filthy little mudblood," she screamed, carving the word into Hermione's skin. That wasn't just rage, it was belief. Bellatrix never faltered, never pitied, never looked back. Voldemort trusted her because she felt nothing for anyone but him. That's what made her dangerous. That's what made her worthy. True Poggiratells didn't pause at suffering, they caused it. To pity the enemy was to declare oneself unfit. Voldemort's world had no room for hesitation, not when killing, not when punishing, not even when watching children suffer. When the Carrows took over Hogwarts, they tortured students in front of other students. "If you don't want detention, you'll do it," Amicus said, shoving wands into trembling hands. Some refused, they were broken. Others obeyed, they were marked. The Dark Lord watched it all unfold, knowing that only the heartless could rule, and only the cruel could serve. Number 13. Be ready to sacrifice yourself. Barty Crouch Jr. didn't flinch when the chains closed around his wrists. He had watched the others scream, deny, weep. He did none of that. His eyes burned with twisted pride. "I am loyal to the Dark Lord," he shouted in open court, defying the Ministry, his father, and the world. Azkaban was not his punishment. It was his offering. He chose torment over betrayal. He endured the Dementors without regret. Years later, when he escaped and returned to Voldemort's side, he did it without asking for reward. He disguised himself as Mad-Eye Moody, corrupted Hogwarts from within, and handed Harry Potter over. He knew he would die, but that didn't matter. His life already belonged to someone else. Death Eaters didn't serve for glory. They served for purpose. Voldemort demanded sacrifice not as a request, but as a condition. Those who hesitated were discarded. Those who obeyed became legends. Take the case of Regulus Black, a pureblood, a Slytherin, a follower. And yet, when he discovered the truth about the Horcruxes, he made a choice. A silent rebellion, not for justice, but to correct what he had helped unleash. "He's a good boy," Creature would later whisper. Regulus didn't announce his betrayal. He didn't ask to be remembered. He walked into the cave, drank the poison, and died alone. No praise, no gravestone, just sacrifice. Bellatrix Lestrange glorified pain. But even her fanaticism masked a deeper truth. She would have died for Voldemort at any second. And she almost did, many times. During the battle at the Department of Mysteries, she fought like someone already dead, screaming curses, taunting Sirius, trying to spill as much blood as possible before the auras closed in. "He's coming, Harry," she hissed. "You're going to meet him." That wasn't fear. That was joy. She didn't live to survive. She lived to serve. And if death came in the process, it would be a gift. The mark of a true Death Eater wasn't power. It was willingness. Willingness to bleed, burn, rot, and vanish as long as the Dark Lord willed it. There were no martyrs in Voldemort's army, only weapons. Once used, they were discarded without sorrow. To follow him meant erasing the self completely. Your thoughts, your fear, your future, it was all his. If you had anything left you weren't willing to lose, then you didn't belong. Number 14, avoid friendships with Muggles or Muggle-borns. Draco Malfoy knew the rule long before he received the Dark Mark. His father, Lucius, drilled it into him. We don't associate with their kind. Not just a matter of blood, it was a matter of ideology. Muggles and Muggle-borns weren't equals. They were distractions, weaknesses. And yet, in his early Hogwarts years, Draco couldn't help but watch Hermione Granger with a mix of curiosity and disdain. She was brilliant, fearless, but also a threat to everything he had been taught. Any hint of admiration had to be buried beneath layers of mockery and scorn. Voldemort didn't tolerate blurred lines. If Draco had ever dared to speak to her with kindness, he would have been punished, not only by his family, but by the Dark Lord himself. The Death Eaters operated on isolation. Friendship with a Muggle-born wasn't just forbidden, it was betrayal. Peter Pettigrew is a cautionary tale. Though not a Death Eater in the formal sense, his ties to the Marauders, especially to the half-blood James Potter, were seen as a liability. When he finally joined Voldemort, he did so out of fear and desperation, not loyalty, and Voldemort knew it. Pettigrew's death, killed by his own silver hand for a moment of hesitation, was a final reminder: sympathy for the wrong side is fatal. "You're going to kill me?" he whispered. "After I've helped you?" But Voldemort had already judged him unworthy. Even Severus Snape, perhaps the most complex of Voldemort's followers, kept his emotions hidden behind a mask of cold indifference. His love for Lily Evans, Muggle-born, was a secret he buried deep. When Voldemort decided to kill her, Snape begged him to spare her, not out of ideology but obsession. "Anything," Snape pleaded. That weakness cost him dearly. From that day on, he walked a knife's edge, forced to prove again and again that his ties to the Muggle-born world were severed. In Voldemort's world, emotion was dangerous, attachment was death. The command was clear: no bonds with the impure. To the Death Eaters, Muggle-borns weren't just outsiders, they were enemies. Any Death Eater caught sharing loyalty, affection, or even civil conversation with one risked not only their life, but the collapse of everything Voldemort had built. Bellatrix Lestrange said it without apology. "You filthy little mudblood," she spat at Hermione. That wasn't just hatred, it was doctrine. To love a Muggle-born was to betray the cause, and no Death Eater survived betrayal. Number 15. Maintain an atmosphere of fear. Lucius Malfoy did not need to speak to be feared. His posture alone, his cold aristocratic features, the silent menace in his grey eyes, all of it communicated a simple message. You are beneath me, and I could ruin your life with a flick of my wand. This aura was not accidental. It was cultivated, carefully constructed under the tutelage of the Dark Lord himself. Voldemort knew that real power was not just in the curse, but in the anticipation of it. The terror that preceded violence was often more potent than the violence itself. He demanded from his followers not merely obedience, but spectacle, a presence so chilling it haunted the dreams of all who saw them. A Death Eater was not just an assassin, he was a myth in motion. Bellatrix Lestrange embraced this philosophy with every fibre of her being. Her reputation preceded her like a poisonous fog. She didn't kill for necessity. She killed for devotion, for the art of fear. Her very presence in the battle of the Department of Mysteries had caused panic among the younger members of the Order. Even Sirius Black, her own cousin, could not hide the concern in his eyes when they faced each other. She did not need Voldemort's orders to unleash destruction. She carried the ideology in her bones. After murdering Sirius, she laughed. It wasn't just cruelty, it was branding. She was marking herself in the minds of the survivors, making sure they would never forget that death wore her name. The Death Eater's strategy was not chaos for its own sake. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. Every unexplained disappearance, every mutilated body, every Muggle family found slaughtered in their own home served the same goal: to convince the wizarding world that nowhere was safe. Fenrir Greyback, though not a Death Eater in the official sense, was used precisely for this purpose. A werewolf who delighted in turning children, Greyback was an instrument of fear that no propaganda could match. Parents told their children stories about him not to entertain, but to terrify, and this terror was currency in Voldemort's regime. The more frightened people became, the more they submitted. The rule was unspoken, but absolute. A Death Eater who was not feared had failed. Even without orders, they were expected to act in ways that deepened the legend of their cruelty. Severus Snape, while maintaining his double life, knew this. In the presence of the other Death Eaters, he maintained a demeanor so cold and clinical that it left even his allies unsure of his true intentions. His mere silence became threatening. This was the essence of Voldemort's command. Fear must not rest, not even for a moment. As the dark mark blazed across the sky, it was not just a signal of death, but a promise. Fear has arrived, and you will remember it. One of the clearest examples of this mandate in action was the attack on the Quidditch World Cup. The Death Eaters descended not with a clear plan to kill, but with the express purpose of terrorizing. Muggles were levitated and tortured, tents were set ablaze, and the entire event, meant to be a celebration, was transformed into a memory of dread. No targets, no assassinations, only the raw imprint of fear. It was spectacle without mercy. As Barty Crouch Jr. later admitted under Veritaserum, we were meant to be remembered. And remembered they were. It is no accident that Voldemort reintroduced himself to the world with a murder. In Goblet of Fire, Cedric Diggory's death wasn't strategic. It was symbolic. A bright, beloved, innocent boy was killed not because he posed a threat, but because his death would send a message. Voldemort did not whisper when he returned. He roared. He wanted the wizarding world to understand that even their brightest hopes could be extinguished in an instant. "Kill the spare," he said, and with those words he reignited an age of terror. There was no attempt at subtlety. There was only the message, fear us or die. During the Second Wizarding War, Voldemort did not just rely on brute force, he allowed the Ministry of Magic to fall into the hands of his puppets. Fear was now institutionalized. Dolores Umbridge's office became a fortress of surveillance and intimidation. Muggle-borns were dragged in for interrogations, and families disappeared overnight. The inquisitorial squad at Hogwarts mirrored this ideology. They weren't meant to keep order. They were meant to crush defiance through fear. Even the school was no longer a refuge. "The ministry has fallen. Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming." These words, broadcast by Kingsley through the radio, captured the despair perfectly. The enemy was no longer at the gates. It was the gate. Voldemort himself rarely appeared publicly. This, too, was by design. The less people saw him, the more they feared him. He became a mythic terror, a whispered name, literally unspeakable. Even the taboo on his name, a jinx that summoned Death Eaters to anyone who dared utter it, turned speech itself into a weapon. Language was corrupted, and silence became survival. Saying Voldemort wasn't just brave, it was suicidal. "People are disappearing daily," Lupin had said. "You can't be sure of anything anymore." And this uncertainty was precisely what Voldemort wanted. A Death Eater's true weapon was not the wand, but the fear that came before it. In Half-Blood Prince, when Draco Malfoy let Death Eaters into Hogwarts, their first move was not immediate destruction. Instead, they spread through the castle like a plague, sowing panic. When Dumbledore fell from the astronomy tower, it was not merely a death, it was a message written in blood. If even the greatest wizard could be eliminated, what hope did anyone else have? Voldemort's rule was psychological. His enemies had to feel defeated before the battle even began. Number 16 never questioned Voldemort's immortality. When the dark mark faded from the sky above Godric's Hollow, and the wizarding world breathed in relief, the true test for the Death Eaters had only just begun. For those who had sworn loyalty to Lord Voldemort, his disappearance was not a defeat, it was a trial of faith, a trial that revealed the trembling hearts beneath black robes and silver masks. The rule was simple, unspoken yet absolute: never doubt the immortality of the Dark Lord. He could not die. He would not die. His disappearance was a pause, not an end. And those who treated it as the latter would live to regret their cowardice. The Dark Lord, though banished to the shadows of a cursed form, remembered everything. Lucius Malfoy, with all his wealth and influence, stood as a monument to that hypocrisy. In the years following Voldemort's fall, Lucius did not actively deny his past, but nor did he champion his master's inevitable return. He allowed his robes to gather dust, his mark to fade beneath expensive sleeves. When the Dark Lord rose again in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, it was not the Ministry of Magic who quaked in fear. It was Lucius and others like him whose silence had betrayed the unspoken rule, for Voldemort had eyes beyond sight, ears beyond sound. Faith was the currency of loyalty, and Lucius had spent his long ago. The punishment did not come immediately. Voldemort was too clever for that. Instead, he welcomed Lucius back with poisonous grace, assigned him tasks, allowed him to believe that all was forgiven. But behind every order was a test, behind every compliment a knife. Lucius was given the prophecy mission at the Department of Mysteries, not as a reward but as a stage. And when he failed, when the prophecy shattered, so did the illusion of forgiveness. Azkaban awaited him not only as punishment from the Ministry, but as a prison in the Dark Lord's mind. For Voldemort does not forget cowardice, and even in victory he remembers who hesitated. Bellatrix Lestrange, on the other hand, never wavered. When others vanished into polite society, she walked willingly into Azkaban with her heart burning for her master. Her devotion was fanatical, her belief unwavering. To her, the fall of Voldemort was a test sent by him, and her suffering was a badge of honor. "The Dark Lord will rise again, Crouch. Throw us into Azkaban. We will wait," she screamed, during her trial, her voice echoing with fire. She knew the rule, she lived it. And when the time came, Voldemort welcomed her, not just as a servant, but as a prophet of his return. In a world of false loyalty, she was a diamond in the dirt. There is no greater insult to the Dark Lord than doubt. Doubt is weakness. Doubt is betrayal disguised as reason. Severus Snape, master of double lives, knew this better than most. Even while playing his part at Dumbledore's side, he never allowed a flicker of disbelief to pass his lips in the presence of Voldemort. To serve both sides and yet be trusted required an unshakable understanding of Voldemort's expectations. Snape understood the danger of expressing hesitation, even in silence. It was not only about loyalty, it was about projection. The Dark Lord saw into minds, and Snape had to ensure that not even a whisper of uncertainty was left unguarded. The unspoken rule that governed the Death Eaters was not merely a demand, it was a doctrine. Faith in Voldemort's immortality was more than belief, it was survival. When Peter Pettigrew stumbled upon the remains of his master, broken and hidden, his decision to serve came not from courage but from the desperate knowledge that denial would mean death. Pettigrew's terror made him act where others hesitated, and for that Voldemort spared him for a time. Even cowardice was acceptable so long as it did not deny the inevitability of the Dark Lord's return. But doubt? Doubt was treason. In Malfoy Manor, when Voldemort returned fully, seated like a king at the head of a long table, the room was thick with unspoken fear. Those who had lived comfortably during his absence now sat like ghosts of their former selves, haunted by the knowledge that the price of disloyalty had not yet been paid. Voldemort's words were calm, almost tender, but the murder of Charity Burbage, executed mid-meal, was a warning wrapped in blood. He was reminding them that while time had passed, his standards had not. You either believed in his immortality, or you did not deserve to live. Yaxley, Travers, Nott, all these men had resumes of past service, but their loyalty during the dark years was questionable. They clung to Voldemort not out of belief, but out of fear and opportunity. They did not sing his name during the dark decade. They waited, watched, and when he returned, they swore oaths again, as if faith could be reignited by mere presence. Voldemort knew better. True followers had never stopped believing. They had never needed proof. That is what separated the Bellatrixes from the Malfoys, the true Death Eaters from the Pretenders. There is irony in the fate of Draco Malfoy, the boy raised beneath the shadow of that rule, but never taught its depth. Voldemort used him not because he believed in the boy's ability, but because he wanted to see the Malfoys tremble. He wanted to remind them that their period of polite disobedience had not been forgotten. To believe in Voldemort's immortality meant accepting his justice even when it landed at your doorstep. Draco was forced to carry the mark of his family's failures, a living example of what happened when belief became convenience. Number 17, treat Muggles as resources, not people. In the cold and calculated doctrine of Lord Voldemort, one commandment stood firm like a pillar of darkness. The world must be divided into those who possess magic and those who do not. For the Death Eaters, this wasn't merely ideology, it was sacred law. And at the heart of it was a chilling principle. Muggles were not to be seen as people. They were to be viewed, used, and discarded as resources, tools, or at best, livestock. Their lack of magic rendered them beneath the right to compassion. This belief was not whispered behind closed doors. It was taught, enforced, and expected with the same weight as loyalty itself. The moment a follower of the Dark Lord showed pity toward a Muggle, they exposed a fatal flaw. Compassion was heresy. Humanity was betrayal. Bellatrix Lestrange embodied this dogma with terrifying devotion. Her cruelty wasn't just a product of madness, it was obedience to the unspoken law. During the torture of Hermione Granger at Malfoy Manor, Bellatrix never flinched at the screams that echoed through the halls. She carved the word mudblood into Hermione's arm, not out of blind rage, but to reinforce the idea that those of Muggle origin were nothing more than dirt, raw material to be shaped, scarred, and discarded. The pain she inflicted was not only physical, it was ideological. She knew Hermione was brilliant, brave and strong, but her blood made her disposable. Voldemort's law demanded that such people be put in their place. Even the brightest light meant nothing if it came from impure origins. The Ministry of Magic, once infiltrated by Voldemort's regime, reflected this commandment in official policy. When Pius Thicknesser, under the Imperious Curse, allowed the ministry to become a puppet state, one of the first acts was the creation of the Muggle-born Registration Commission. Dolores Umbridge, now a willing servant of the regime, oversaw inquisitions that treated Muggle-born witches and wizards as thieves who had stolen magic. Their heritage became evidence of guilt. Magic, Voldemort preached, belonged to the right kind of people. Those without magical ancestry were seen as interlopers, as parasites, and so they were interrogated, imprisoned, and in some cases vanished. No trial, no defense, just extraction and disposal like objects, not people. Even the use of Muggle homes and bodies became common practice. When Voldemort seized the Riddle House, he desecrated it not just as a base of operations, but as a symbol of dominance over the Muggle world. Tom Riddle had murdered his own father, a Muggle, and then claimed his house as a throne of darkness. He summoned Nagini to slither through the corridors where innocent people once lived. The air grew thick with decay and dread. Muggles weren't mourned, they were erased. Their deaths were nothing more than a shifting of resources, a clearing of land for a superior species. Voldemort's followers watched this and learned. The death of a Muggle was not tragedy, it was efficiency. Barty Crouch Jr. took the lesson to heart. When impersonating Mad-Eye Moody during the Triwizard Tournament, he used his role to manipulate events with surgical precision. One of the unforgivable curses he taught, the Imperious Curse, highlighted the control one could exert over another being's will. It wasn't coincidence that such lessons were introduced during this regime. Voldemort's ideology turned people into property. Minds became tools. A Muggle under the Imperious Curse wasn't a victim. They were a weapon to be aimed, and if they broke under the weight of the curse, they were simply replaced. Barty's use of this magic wasn't merely practical, it echoed the belief that others existed solely to be controlled. Peter Pettigrew, though cowardly and weak, adopted the same cruelty in the name of usefulness. When he helped Voldemort regain his body, he didn't hesitate to sacrifice a Muggle for the ritual. The bone of the father, the flesh of the servant, the blood of the enemy, this dark incantation demanded a life. A Muggle was chosen. An unknown man died screaming in the woods, far from home, for a cause he couldn't understand. He wasn't given a name in the books because he wasn't given one in Voldemort's mind. He was merely a component, a sacrifice, a part of the spell. That moment captured the essence of Death Eater morality. Muggles were not human, they were ingredients. Lucius Malfoy, with his air of superiority and wealth, viewed Muggles as nothing more than a lower class meant to serve. His disdain was masked by elegance, but his actions revealed the truth. He gladly placed Tom Riddle's diary into the hands of Ginny Weasley, knowing it could unleash a monster bred to purge the school of Muggle-borns. Lucius didn't care who was hurt, as long as the right order of blood was restored. When the diary nearly killed several students, his only concern was political fallout. Not life, not children, but status. Even his own son Draco was raised in this worldview, trained to believe that Muggle-borns were filth and that helping them was shameful. The Death Eaters targeted Muggle institutions with surgical strikes. The attack on the Quidditch World Cup was not merely an act of terror, it was a demonstration. Muggle families were levitated, tortured, and mocked above the campgrounds. The sky burned with the dark mark. Witches and wizards screamed, children cried, but the Muggles were silent, frozen by fear, unable to understand the hatred hurled at them. To the Death Eaters, it was sport. To Voldemort, it was a message. These people have no place in the new world. They are decorations for our cruelty. They are props in our performance of power. Number 18. Suppress individuality. The Death Eaters were not a collection of free spirits, nor were they a band of unique minds bound by shared ideology. They were instruments, extensions of one will, one vision, and one cruelty. The essence of their survival lay in uniformity, submission, and the complete erasure of identity. In the shadows of the Dark Lord, individuality was not merely discouraged, it was dangerous. And to those who dared stand out, the price was either death or disgrace. Among all followers of Lord Voldemort, the unspoken rule was chillingly clear. Do not draw attention to yourself. Do not be different. Do not say I, only we, only him. The Death Eaters lived in a hierarchy where the top belonged to one man only. Tom Riddle had never been interested in partners. Even when he gathered the brightest minds at Hogwarts under the guise of charming leadership, his true intention was always to use, discard, and dominate. The same principle applied to his adult followers. Lucius Malfoy, with his pristine robes and manicured presence, understood early on that flair had its limits. He learned too late that sophistication, when it began to outshine loyalty, became a liability. After his humiliating failure at the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort punished him not for lack of commitment, but for the arrogance of believing his status gave him leeway. His fall was not just strategic, it was a warning. In Voldemort's world, there was no room for personal ambition unless it was completely aligned with his own. Barty Crouch Jr., perhaps one of the most fanatically loyal of all, proved this by obliterating his own name and identity. He spent a year as Mad-Eye Moody through the use of Polyjuice Potion, not as a trickster, but as a believer. In becoming someone else, he was ironically the perfect Death Eater, an empty vessel for his master's plan. His genius was not his own, it was useful only because it served the grand design. "The Dark Lord has returned," he said triumphantly before being kissed by a Dementor, his soul torn away. There was no tragedy, no farewell to the man he had been, because there was no man, only a tool. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, whose madness lit every room she entered like dark fire, knew her place. She was volatile, passionate, and undeniably unique, but she bowed lower than anyone. Her laughter may have echoed through battlefields, but her allegiance was silent and absolute. In her most unhinged moments, she remained centered around her lord, whispering his name with the reverence of a believer and the hunger of a zealot. "The Dark Lord walks again among us," she said, not in triumph, but in rapture. Her personal desires, be it violence, prestige, or perhaps even love, were never allowed to challenge his supremacy. That is why she survived, even thrived, because her individuality never threatened the unity Voldemort demanded. Regulus Black, who once flirted with Death Eater ideology, was repelled not only by its cruelty but by the suffocation it required. Raised in a family where identity was bound to bloodline, he had thought serving Voldemort would give him power. Instead, it made him invisible. When he saw what the Horcrux truly represented, a soul split in the name of immortality, not community, he rebelled. But rebellion cost him his life, and Voldemort never mentioned his name again. In the Dark Lord's empire, memory was reserved only for the loyal, and even they were shadows. Peter Pettigrew, the weakest among them, found his survival in total erasure of self. He betrayed his friends not for ambition, but because Voldemort gave him direction, however cruel. Once accepted into the circle of Death Eaters, he curled into himself like a frightened animal, always lurking behind stronger figures. He dared not express an opinion unless asked. His silver hand, a gift from Voldemort, was not a symbol of gratitude but of control, a permanent reminder that he was property. When he hesitated to kill Harry, the hand turned against him. The message was brutal, obedience over conscience, always. Uniformity among the Death Eaters was not just about behavior, it extended to appearance. They wore the same robes, the same masks, the same insignia burnt into their arms. The dark mark was not a badge of honor, but of ownership. Even their faces were hidden when they acted in public, not for anonymity, but to emphasize sameness. Their voices were stripped of inflection, their movements became rehearsed. There was no room for creativity, no improvisation. Voldemort did not want followers who thought, he wanted soldiers who obeyed. Dolohov, Yaxley, Rookwood, names mentioned often, but personalities rarely described. They had skills, yes, but they never sought distinction. They understood that the moment one Death Eater stood out, they became a liability. Their lives were shaped by fear and hierarchy. The few who tried to act independently, like the Carrows, who revelled in their own cruelty at Hogwarts, did so only within the confines of the Master's will. Even their brutality was borrowed, not born. Snape was the exception, but only because he played a double game. Even then he wore the mask of the obedient Death Eater perfectly. To Voldemort he was the archetype of cold, detached service. When Snape killed Dumbledore, it was not just an act of violence, it was a declaration that he had no will of his own. "The Dark Lord trusts me," he said, and that trust came not because Snape was brilliant, but because he had proven again and again that his personal interests were subservient to the cause. Only after Voldemort's death would the truth of his rebellion come to light. The irony is that Voldemort himself had once been obsessed with uniqueness. As a student, Tom Riddle cultivated charm and intelligence to distinguish himself. But the moment he became the Dark Lord, he demanded sameness from others. Why? Because he feared what he once was. He understood that individual ambition leads to dissent, that a clever mind, left unchecked, might mirror his own. Therefore he crushed it wherever it emerged. Loyalty had to be absolute. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore says, "You are forgetting the next great adventure, death." Voldemort, obsessed with escaping that truth, sought to make himself eternal not through legacy but through control. The failure of this philosophy is written in the collapse of his army. In the Battle of Hogwarts, the Death Eaters were more terrified than committed. They lacked leadership, initiative, and trust in each other. Once Voldemort began to fall, they disbanded like smoke. They had never formed real bonds. There was no camaraderie, no shared belief system beyond obedience. Unlike the Order of the Phoenix, who fought for each other, the Death Eaters fought for fear of being punished. Their silence became their curse. When Narcissa Malfoy lied to Voldemort about Harry's death, it was a flicker of individuality in a sea of uniformity. She did not act out of rebellion, but out of maternal instinct. Yet even that quiet act cracked the foundation of Voldemort's rule. He had built an empire where personal motives had no place. And yet in the end, it was a mother's love, a private truth, that brought him down. Her question to Harry, "Is Draco alive?" was whispered, not shouted, but it carried more weight than a dozen dark marks. The tragedy of Voldemort's reign was that he saw identity as a threat. He could not understand that loyalty born of choice is stronger than loyalty born of fear. He surrounded himself with echoes, reflections, and puppets, and thus remained blind to the storm rising outside his chamber. The very rule he imposed, no individuality, was his undoing, for while his enemies had names, faces, stories, and pain, his followers had only masks. And when the masks fell, there was nothing underneath. To be a Death Eater was to surrender your soul, not just to evil, but to emptiness. It was not a brotherhood. It was not a movement. It was an execution of one man's desire to be God. But gods do not require worshippers. They require mirrors, and mirrors, as every child knows, can shatter. Bellatrix Lestrange, so fiery and devoted, died screaming the name of her master, not her family's name, not her own name, his. And in that final cry was the truth of every Death Eater. A person erased. Number 19, preserve order within the ranks. Barty Crouch Jr. believed in order, not the dull, bureaucratic sort his father once worshipped, but a deeper kind, ruthless, silent, and pure. For him, serving the Dark Lord was not simply about terrorizing Muggles or enforcing superiority. It was about eliminating decay before it could spread. It was a code embedded in every true follower's mind. Purity within the ranks must be preserved. Doubt, fear, or pity were weeds, and weeds could not be tolerated. Crouch Jr. had watched others fall, not because they opposed the Dark Lord openly, but because they allowed hesitation to fester. He remembered Regulus Black, whose heart had been too soft, too confused, and who had vanished into whispers and silence. That kind of disloyalty was an infection. It was not enough to be loyal in word or even deed. The Dark Lord expected more. He demanded that each Death Eater become a guardian of the cause, a watchman against internal collapse. That meant observing one another as much as they observed the world outside. The greatest form of allegiance was not obedience, it was vigilance. Many of our oldest family trees become diseased at the root, Lucius Malfoy once reflected, and it takes a sharp eye to know where to cut. It was understood that weakness wasn't always shouted, it often whispered from dark corners behind masked faces, in the form of hesitation and misplaced mercy. Snape had learned this lesson the hard way, not because he faltered, but because others watched him too closely. During the first rise of the Dark Lord, Severus was viewed with a measure of suspicion, not for his skill, but for his silences. He did not drink with the others, did not join in the revelry after raids. Some saw that as aloofness, others saw a crack. When Avery once suggested Snape had let a Muggle child live, Rodolphus Lestrange quietly noted it. Whether true or not, the rumour was passed along. The Dark Lord did not act immediately, but Snape was summoned and asked about the incident in a tone that made clear someone had been watching. Trust was a shifting thing in Voldemort's ranks. Even those closest to him were never immune to scrutiny. There was a cruel elegance to the rule. Purity must be protected from within. When Igor Karkaroff began to grow uneasy, he made the grave mistake of trying to escape justice by revealing names to the Ministry. To Voldemort, this was not merely treason, it was rot. "I returned," Voldemort said in the graveyard, "and I asked myself, who had the courage to remain loyal?" Karkaroff had not. He had chosen self-preservation. He was not hunted only for betrayal, but for corruption. A coward within the ranks was more dangerous than a dozen auras. The Death Eaters understood it was not just about killing enemies, it was about excising traitors. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the purest embodiment of Voldemort's code, had no tolerance for softness. Her devotion was fanatic, unshakable. When her own cousin, Sirius Black, defected and joined the Order, she did not speak of him with regret, only venom. "He is not my family," she said with a twisted pride. "Blood is nothing when polluted." She viewed even family as expendable if they strayed. This was the essence of Voldemort's command, to prioritize the cause above all. It was not bloodlines that secured loyalty, but actions. The name Black meant nothing if not backed by belief. Even among those who stayed, purity was never assumed. It had to be proven constantly. When the Dark Lord assigned a mission, refusal was not merely failure, it was defilement. Rabastan Lestrange once hesitated to torture a captured Muggle-born child. He thought no one noticed, but someone had. Within days he was sent to the front lines of a violent raid in Ireland where he nearly died. The message was clear. Mercy has no place here. No one confronted him. No one needed to. The system was self-correcting. There was no honor in protecting the faltering. Reporting a comrade for showing weakness was not cowardice, it was loyalty. This twisted ethic kept the ranks sharp, disciplined, afraid of one another, but united under fear. The Dark Lord had crafted a network of paranoia that masqueraded as structure. The idea was simple: support the cause or be crushed by it. No exceptions. The line between failure and treason was razor thin, and no one walked it for long without bleeding. Even Draco Malfoy, still barely a man, was given a chance to prove he belonged. His mission to kill Dumbledore was not just punishment, it was a test. The Dark Lord wanted to see if this boy, born to one of his most trusted followers, could carry the weight of conviction. When Draco faltered, others saw. Bellatrix saw. Snape saw. The boy's hesitation was a warning sign. It was not enough that he tried. He had to succeed, or someone else would be sent in his place. Not to help him, but to finish what he couldn't. And yet, Snape, always playing a deeper game, did what few dared. He intervened. He killed Dumbledore. To many Death Eaters, this was an act of strength. They did not see the complexities behind it. They saw a man stepping in where a boy had failed. Snape's status rose not because of loyalty, but because of execution. In Voldemort's ranks, what mattered was results. But even then, eyes remained on Snape, always watching, always doubting. One act of strength could be undone by one whisper of doubt. The Carrows, tasked with running Hogwarts under Voldemort's control, enforced the rule with particular brutality. Alecto and Amicus believed in maintaining order through fear. When students defied them, they didn't just punish, they made examples. But even they watched one another. It was a dance of mutual distrust. If one of them hesitated, the other would report it. The purity of the ranks demanded this kind of unrelenting vigilance. No kindness, no questioning, only fear. Even Peter Pettigrew, the most pathetic of Voldemort's servants, understood this principle. He clung to his position like a rat to crumbs, terrified of being seen as expendable. He obeyed, grovelled, and offered information to keep himself alive. He told the Dark Lord what others said in whispers. He spied, not for glory, but for survival. And yet, even he knew, when he paused in the cellar, hesitating to kill Harry, that moment was fatal. The silver hand, given to him by Voldemort himself, recognized his weakness, and it crushed him. Voldemort had no use for loyalty tainted by pity. As the Second War wore on, the ranks began to thin, not from the outside, aura, attacks and resistance, but from within. Suspicion, fear, and internal purges became more common. It was a silent war beneath the loud one. Some vanished, others were reassigned to impossible missions. The ones who questioned too loudly simply disappeared. Voldemort was not just at war with the world. He was at war with doubt. The Dark Lord had long abandoned the notion of camaraderie. "There is no good and evil," he had once said, through Quirrell. "Only power, and those too weak to seek it." That philosophy guided every rule he imposed. To protect power, one had to ensure no weakness took root. Purity of ideology, of action, of purpose. Not for moral reasons, but for survival. The machine could not afford a single broken cog. One hesitation could unravel everything. This was why so many of Voldemort's inner circle died not at the hands of Dumbledore's army or the Order, but by each other, or by Voldemort himself. Rookwood, Yaxley, Travers, each of them served faithfully, but only for as long as their usefulness outweighed their doubts. The moment hesitation crept in or failure loomed, they were cast aside. Loyalty was never enough. Devotion had to be ruthless. It had to be clean. So when the final battle came, and the Dark Lord stood surrounded by faces once familiar, there were fewer than before. The inner circle had been purged by the very ideals it once upheld. What remained was not a brotherhood, but a remnant, a handful of believers too afraid to falter. For all his power, Voldemort ruled by a law that consumed itself. Purity was enforced until only fear remained, and in that fear, silence grew. Number 20, trust no one except the Dark Lord. In the cold heart of the Death Eater's creed, There was one commandment more sacred than any spell or blood oath: trust no one but the Dark Lord. This rule was not a whisper among the ranks nor a subtle understanding. It was a law etched into the soul of every follower of Voldemort, taught through pain, reinforced through terror, and sustained through betrayal. The dark mark upon their arms was not a symbol of unity. It was a reminder that their loyalty belonged to one master only. All others, even fellow Death Eaters, were expendable. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most fervent of all Voldemort's servants, exemplified this ethos. Her fanatical devotion to the Dark Lord was unmatched, but even she harbored no illusions about her comrades. She respected no one's power but his. She mocked Lucius Malfoy for his failures, derided Snape for his unclear allegiances, and showed contempt for any Death Eater who sought comfort or companionship in the ranks. She stood alone in her madness, not because she lacked allies, but because she knew better than to believe in them. When Voldemort called, she answered with fire and fury, not out of camaraderie, but because his will was the only truth she recognized. It was Voldemort himself who engineered this poisonous culture. He encouraged competition, not collaboration. He wanted his followers jealous of each other's favor, paranoid of one another's loyalty, desperate to prove themselves by dragging others down. "There is no good and evil, there is only power," he once said, and to wield that power one had to abandon any notion of friendship. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore warned Harry, "You are forgetting that to Voldemort, loyalty is a commodity." To Voldemort, trust was not a virtue, it was a weakness. Severus Snape's double life exemplifies this lack of trust. Though he rose high in Voldemort's inner circle, Snape was never truly one of them. Even as he stood beside other Death Eaters, Voldemort questioned his loyalty, tested his devotion, and manipulated his role. He tasked Snape with watching Draco Malfoy not out of concern for the boy, but to ensure Lucius's failure would not become rebellion. When Snape killed Dumbledore, it was not seen by others as a show of loyalty, but rather as a dangerous shift in power. Voldemort did not reward Snape with warmth, only with further scrutiny. The murder of Barty Crouch Jr. by his own master illustrates the expendability of followers. Though Crouch had engineered the resurrection of Voldemort through an elaborate plot of deception and infiltration, his usefulness was temporary. Once Voldemort had returned to power, Crouch's significance waned. He was not honored for his loyalty, but obliterated by a curse for knowing too much. In the Goblet of Fire, it is not the act of devotion that preserves a Death Eater. It is their silence, their fear, and their obedience. Voldemort's only reward is continued servitude. This philosophy infected the Malfoy family most cruelly. Lucius, once a favorite, fell from grace after the disaster at the Department of Mysteries. His wife, Narcissa, pleaded for her son's life not to Voldemort, but to Snape, whom she barely trusted. Even within their own home, the Malfoys could not speak freely. Their wealth and status meant nothing in the Dark Lord's eyes. Narcissa's decision to lie to Voldemort about Harry's death was not only an act of maternal desperation, it was a rebellion against the doctrine of blind trust. She gambled with her life because she had no faith left in the creature she once served. Among the Carrows, Alecto and Amicus, this principle was reduced to brutal simplicity. They tortured students at Hogwarts not out of belief in Voldemort's ideals, but because they feared his wrath. They turned on each other in moments of crisis, each more concerned with saving their own skin than protecting the other. Loyalty did not exist. Fear was the only glue that held them together, and it was dissolving fast. When Voldemort vanished, so did their courage. Their alliance was a fiction, born of necessity, destroyed by reality. Even Peter Pettigrew, whose betrayal of James and Lily Potter granted Voldemort the chance to kill Harry, learned that gratitude had no place in the Dark Lord's code. For years, Pettigrew lived in fear, clinging to the Death Eaters because he had nowhere else to go. When he showed the slightest hesitation in executing Voldemort's orders, he was punished. In the Deathly Hallows, Voldemort placed a magical silver hand upon him, a gift that became a death sentence. When Pettigrew hesitated to strangle Harry, the hand turned on him. Mercy was treason. The silver hand turned on its owner, the book says, the hand Voldemort had given him, and strangled him where he stood. It was not enough to serve. One had to obey without question. The hierarchy within the Death Eaters was an illusion. There were no real ranks, no stable positions, no bonds of brotherhood. Only Voldemort existed as a constant. Every other person in the room was a rival, a liability, a possible traitor. When Igor Karkaroff fled after the dark mark burned once more, it proved what Voldemort believed all along. Fear is stronger than loyalty. Karkaroff, once a proud Death Eater, could not bear the thought of returning to that world. He had tasted the Dark Lord's justice before and knew it would not be tempered by time. His corpse was found days later, the mark carved into the sky above him like a signature. Voldemort's return in the graveyard shattered any notion of unity among his followers. He called them out by name, Avery, McNair, Crabbe, Goyle, Nott, and humiliated them for not seeking him out. "You who I have called my friends," he said, "do not deny me." But there was no warmth in the accusation. He didn't want reunion, he wanted submission. They were not friends, they were assets. He used guilt as a blade, shame as a leash, and fear as a chain. Their loyalty was not cherished, it was demanded at wand point. When Dumbledore's army formed in secret, it highlighted a truth that Voldemort could never replicate. Harry, Hermione, Neville, they trusted each other. They grew stronger because they had something Voldemort's followers never would, genuine connection. While the Death Eaters devoured each other in suspicion, the young rebels built resilience through friendship. That contrast, subtle as it may seem, marked the ultimate flaw in Voldemort's ideology. His army was powerful, but brittle. The moment pressure increased, it cracked. No one would die for another. They would only run. The Battle of Hogwarts tore open this truth for all to see. The Death Eaters fought not as a unified force, but as scattered fragments. Some, like the Malfoys, turned their backs and fled. Others, like Dolohov and Yaxley, fought for dominance, not for the cause. Bellatrix died alone, surrounded by enemies, because no one stepped in to protect her. That was the Death Eater's fate, to die alone, feared and unmissed. Voldemort himself, obsessed with prophecy, underestimated the bond between Harry and his allies. He could not fathom that someone would walk into the forest ready to die, not out of fear, but out of love. "Do not pity the dead, Harry," Dumbledore told him. "Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love." In the end, that was Voldemort's curse, not a soul split into pieces, but a heart so hollow it could not understand trust. He surrounded himself with followers who feared him, but not one who loved him. And he designed it that way. He forbade friendship. He outlawed loyalty to anyone but himself. He ensured his Death Eaters would never rise against him in groups, because they could not unite without bonds, and he made sure they had none. Thus the rule endured: never trust anyone but the Dark Lord. It was a doctrine built not on wisdom, but on terror. Voldemort ensured that every Death Eater was isolated, desperate, and suspicious. In doing so, he created an empire of shadows, each figure watching the others, afraid to blink, terrified to speak out of turn. A reign of fear, with no love to soften it, and no trust to hold it together. It was not a mark of strength. It was the seed of his ruin. Number 21. Embrace blood and pain. In the cold heart of the Forbidden Forest, during one of the last nights before the final battle, Voldemort stood before his most loyal followers, his snake-like face illuminated by the faint green glow of the dark mark above. The air was thick with tension and expectation. Every Death Eater gathered knew that weakness, hesitation, or pity had no place in the Dark Lord's ranks. There was one rule, etched not in words but in scars and screams: never fear blood or pain. It was not just a command, it was a rite of passage, a threshold that must be crossed to be considered truly worthy. Voldemort demanded unwavering cruelty, a devotion tested not through words but through acts of unspeakable violence. Bellatrix Lestrange embodied that rule to perfection. For her, inflicting pain was not a duty but a pleasure. She didn't flinch at the sound of breaking bones or shrieks of agony. She basked in them. When she tortured the Longbottoms into madness, it wasn't for information, it was for the thrill of total domination. The Lestranges were sent to Azkaban for torturing the Aurors, Frank and Alice Longbottom, into insanity, Sirius once told Harry. That wasn't an unfortunate chapter in their history, it was their badge of honor. Bellatrix emerged from Azkaban unchanged, untouched by guilt or shame. She walked into Voldemort's presence with pride, knowing she had proven her loyalty in the most sacred way by offering pain on his behalf without remorse. It was not enough to obey Voldemort. He demanded emotional transformation. He wanted his followers to enjoy cruelty, not simply commit it. The killing curse was not a last resort, it was a formality. The Cruciatus curse wasn't just a tool, it was an art form. The first time Draco Malfoy was told to kill Dumbledore, he could barely raise his wand. That hesitation almost cost him his life. He was a pureblood, raised with pride and prejudice, yet, when the moment of truth arrived, his heart trembled. Snape had to step in, finishing what the boy could not. For Voldemort, this was failure. Blood ties, youth, fear, none of that mattered, only results did. If pain frightened you, you did not belong. The ultimate loyalty test came not during battle, but in moments of still silence, when Voldemort would demand the unthinkable. He had no use for followers who spared loved ones. He made his Death Eaters hurt those closest to them, because only then could he be sure that their loyalty was to him alone. It was not metaphorical, it was literal. The pain had to be real, the blood had to spill. When Regulus Black realized what he had joined, it wasn't because he was naive, it was because he believed there were limits. He believed there would be rules even in darkness. He was wrong. Voldemort had no boundaries, and anyone who thought otherwise was doomed to die disillusioned. The Dark Lord's ideology was built on a foundation of desensitization. He wanted his followers to forget what mercy felt like. To him, mercy was a disease of the weak. Lucius Malfoy learned this lesson the hard way. Once he had been a favorite, polished, calculating, persuasive. But when he failed at the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort did not forgive. He punished him not with death, but with humiliation. He let Lucius live, stripped of power, of influence, and worst of all, of his family's protection. Narcissa, too, felt the weight of this cruelty. When she lied to Voldemort to protect Draco, she committed the highest betrayal, but she did it in silence, with eyes that had seen what loyalty truly cost. Her fear wasn't of Voldemort's anger, it was of what he would do to her son to test her. Severus Snape was a paradox among Death Eaters. He had the stomach for pain, for cruelty, but he wielded it selectively. To Voldemort, that was a flaw. Snape did not enjoy inflicting harm. He did it with precision, not passion. He could kill, he could curse, but he never laughed while doing it. That made him suspicious. Voldemort saw in him a tool, not a brother, and so Snape's every move was watched, every word weighed, because Voldemort didn't trust those who hesitated, not even for a moment. There is no good and evil, there is only power, and those too weak to seek it, Quirrell once repeated to Harry. That was the essence of Voldemort's creed. Power was earned through pain, not kindness. Pain was the coin of loyalty. The initiation rituals for new Death Eaters were never described in the books in full detail, but the implications were chilling. It was not enough to pledge yourself. You had to act. You had to hurt. The dark mark was not just a symbol, it was a brand seared into the flesh, a constant reminder that you belonged to something merciless. Imagine the terror of a young recruit standing in a dark room, ordered to use the Cruciatus on a traitor, or worse, a friend. And imagine what Voldemort would do if the wand trembled. That recruit would be the next to scream, not because Voldemort enjoyed waste, but because he saw fear as a disease that needed to be burned away. Even Peter Pettigrew, the most cowardly of them all, understood this rule in the end. When he hesitated to kill Harry in Malfoy Manor, his own silver hand, gifted by Voldemort, strangled him. That moment was symbolic. Voldemort had created a device that could sense disloyalty, hesitation, mercy. Blood and pain were not optional in his world. They were required. The hand was not just enchanted, it was programmed with Voldemort's ideology. It punished pity. It executed weakness. In that instant, even the Dark Lord's absence was a lethal force, embedded in flesh and steel. This rule, the unspoken law of blood and pain, extended beyond the battlefield. Even in times of peace, the Death Eaters had to prove themselves. If the Ministry had fallen, the world under Voldemort would have been built on fear, not governance. Punishments would not be reserved for criminals, but for the inconvenient. When the Muggle Studies professor at Hogwarts dared to teach equality, she was executed before the entire staff, her body left as a lesson. This was not punishment, it was pedagogy. Voldemort believed fear was the best teacher. In the Death Eaters' ranks, compassion was a flaw that had to be extinguished early. If a follower showed concern for collateral damage, Muggle children, fellow wizards, even magical creatures, they were labelled unfit. Rabastan and Rodolphus Lestrange, like Bellatrix, excelled because they questioned nothing. They struck where ordered. They broke bones, cast curses, laughed at cries. They were blank slates filled only with Voldemort's will. He did not want thinkers, he wanted weapons, and weapons should not feel. When Voldemort ordered Nagini to kill Severus Snape, it wasn't only because he believed Snape had betrayed him. It was to make a point. The act was ritualistic, slow, personal. The message was clear to the remaining Death Eaters. If Voldemort can kill even his most trusted lieutenant without flinching, so must you. There are no sacred bonds, no friendships, no exceptions. In Voldemort's world, you survive not by being valuable, but by being willing to do anything. Even bleed, especially bleed. The rise of the Carrows at Hogwarts during the final year was another extension of this law. They turned the school into a camp of discipline and torture. Amicus and Alecto taught students through beatings. Detention meant Cruciatus. Participation was forced. Neville Longbottom bore the scars of resistance not just on his skin but in his eyes. The Death Eaters running the school believed they were shaping a new generation, one that would not hesitate. One that would learn from pain and teach through fear. Voldemort's philosophy was never about ideology. He didn't care for speeches. He didn't ask his followers to understand him, only to serve. And service meant spilling blood without remorse. It was a club whose price of entry was cruelty. To him, morality was the language of the weak, and guilt was a luxury of those who had never seen power. If you wanted to rise, you had to fall into darkness, into brutality, into silence, and once you had fallen, you had to stay there forever. In the end, the only survivors from Voldemort's ranks were those who either changed sides or concealed their conscience well enough to fake devotion. Those who hesitated were purged, those who loved were betrayed, those who hoped were broken. The path of the Death Eater was soaked in blood from the first step. That was the rule, and Voldemort enforced it not with policy, but with pain. Number 22. Be ready to live in hiding. The life of a Death Eater was never meant to be comfortable. It was a life shaped by fear, built on obedience, and maintained through constant movement. Voldemort's most devoted followers were never truly free. Once someone bore the dark mark, they ceased to exist as an ordinary person. They became a shadow, a servant, a soldier in a war that left no room for rest. There was no promise of a quiet home, no assurance of a future without hiding, for the Dark Lord demanded loyalty without conditions, and that meant giving up not just safety but stability itself. The world offered nothing but chaos to those who swore themselves to him. It was not only a physical battle, but a psychological surrender, and many did not survive it. Bellatrix Lestrange may have been the most fanatical of them all, but even she lived with the knowledge that her name was synonymous with terror. She could not walk into Diagon Alley or Hogsmeade. She could not show her face in public without risking immediate capture. The same went for her husband Rodolphus and his brother Rabastan. After the fall of Voldemort during the First War, the Lestranges chose not to run, but their reward was Azkaban. For them, prison was preferable to betrayal. But those who chose freedom instead, if it could be called that, lived in fear every day. They became wanderers in the shadows, living off stolen gold and concealed identities. It was not a life of triumph, but of constant retreat. The case of Rabastan Lestrange after his escape from Azkaban is telling. He was not a man who sought glory. His loyalty was silent, unassuming, and utterly devout. But after Voldemort returned, he was no longer Rabastan. He was a fugitive. The Ministry branded him dangerous, and every town, every inn, every whisper on the street could mean betrayal. He could not contact old friends. He could not trust distant relatives. Even among fellow Death Eaters there was no guarantee of protection. Any moment could be the last. The Dark Lord rewarded success, but he never protected failure. "There is no good and evil, there is only power," Voldemort once told Harry, but he never added that power demanded a life without peace. Severus Snape's story, though unique, is another reflection of what it meant to serve in Voldemort's ranks. Even as a double agent, Snape's life was dictated by paranoia and sacrifice. His every move was calculated, every conversation rehearsed. He could not afford attachment, not truly. His only loyalty was to a dead woman, and even that came at the cost of every other human bond. Voldemort required secrecy above all else. To serve him was to silence every part of yourself that craved comfort. As Snape once told Bellatrix, "The Dark Lord is pleased with me," but what he never said aloud was that being pleasing came at the cost of selfhood. To survive, Snape had to kill pieces of his identity until only duty remained. Sybil Trelawney is not a Death Eater, but her life was forever marked by Voldemort's war. When she made the prophecy that foretold his downfall, she unknowingly signed her own sentence. The Death Eaters did not seek her allegiance, they sought her silence. For years, she lived under Dumbledore's protection at Hogwarts, but not out of luxury. It was her prison, a velvet cage in a castle that had become her sanctuary and her tomb. Had she ever stepped beyond its grounds alone, she would have likely vanished into the hands of the very people who lived in hiding. Even those not branded with the mark were not safe from the reach of the Dark Lord. He demanded loyalty or death. There was no third option. Peter Pettigrew, perhaps the most pathetic of Voldemort's followers, exemplifies the rule of flight. After betraying the Potters, he lived as a rat, literally, for 12 years. Not a day passed where he could sleep peacefully. Every sound was a potential threat. Every familiar footstep might be the one to end his disguise. He abandoned his name, his identity, even his species, for the sake of surviving in Voldemort's absence. And when he was finally discovered, he did not return to his master as a hero, but as a broken shell of a man begging for forgiveness. "Wormtail has been rewarded," Voldemort said, but that reward was fear, servitude, and ultimately death by his own magical hand. Pettigrew never truly escaped. The Malfoy family was a powerful name in the wizarding world. Their manor was once a symbol of prestige, but under Voldemort it became a gilded cage. Lucius Malfoy may have hoped to gain favor, but the moment he failed to retrieve the prophecy, his downfall began. Narcissa, ever loyal to her family above all, was forced to watch her husband's confidence wither and her son be handed over as punishment. Draco's assignment to kill Dumbledore was not just a mission, it was a death sentence. Voldemort turned the Malfoys' wealth and bloodline into tools of manipulation. By the end of the war, the family was huddled together not in glory, but in desperation. Even they, the purest of purebloods, were not safe from the price of servitude. Fenrir Greyback was a beast, a monster even among Death Eaters, but even he understood the need to stay hidden. His loyalty to Voldemort was not ideological, but opportunistic. He used the chaos to satisfy his hunger, but he knew the Ministry hunted him as fiercely as any Death Eater. He stalked the edges of war, living like an animal in the woods, feeding on terror and blood. But he too knew the risk of capture. Greyback never had a home. He had dens, temporary shelters, and hidden lairs. His path was that of a predator, always aware that a larger predator could be just behind him. Even the most violent had to run. Barty Crouch Jr. is a rare example of cunning disguising madness. His escape from Azkaban and impersonation of Alistair Moody during the Triwizard Tournament was a masterstroke of deception, but it was also proof of the Death Eater's endless dance with concealment. He lived for nearly a year under Polyjuice Potion, erasing all signs of himself. A life in constant transformation is no life at all. He had no identity beyond his mission, no future beyond Voldemort's orders. The potion may have hidden his face, but it consumed his soul. Even in his greatest act of loyalty, he could not reclaim his name. He was a mask on borrowed time, and once unmasked, he was silenced forever. Antonin Dolohov, another fierce loyalist, escaped Azkaban only to vanish into the cracks of the magical world. He appeared when summoned, struck when ordered, and disappeared again like smoke. His magic was deadly, but his face was rarely seen. The price of remaining free was invisibility. Dolohov understood that power in Voldemort's world was not public. It was whispered in the dark, sealed in unforgivable curses, and hidden beneath cloaks. He was feared, yes, but also forgotten. To serve the Dark Lord was to become a myth more than a man. Even Voldemort himself lived like a fugitive in his early days. After his failed curse on baby Harry, he drifted like a ghost between hosts, first in the forests of Albania, then through possession and manipulation. He did not sit on a throne, he crept in the dark. He survived on the backs of snakes, rats, and broken souls like Quirrell. His rise to power in the Second War was not through splendor, but through secret gatherings and coded messages. He rose again in the shadows before claiming the spotlight. And even then, he was never truly secure. I who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality. But that path was carved through hidden caves, stolen bodies, and the blood of his followers. Every Death Eater carried the dark mark not only on their skin but in their destiny. It was a brand of war, not of nobility. It summoned them without warning. It burned with pain and demanded obedience. They were never masters of their fate. They were tools, disposable, replaceable, hunted. The romanticism of power was a lie. Their reality was fear, silence, and exile. The mark gave them access to dark magic, but took away everything else. Family, name, peace. Yaxley, who once strutted through the Ministry during Voldemort's infiltration, quickly vanished into obscurity after the Dark Lord's fall. One moment he was rewriting laws and terrorizing Muggleborns. The next, he was just another fugitive with a target on his back. He did not die in battle. He faded away, hunted and forgotten. That is the fate of most Death Eaters. They vanish without legacy, without gravestone, known only for the crimes etched into old records. No one who served Voldemort was ever truly safe. Their loyalty was paid for in stolen lives and shattered identities. The reward was temporary power, but the price was endless pursuit. Whether hiding in forests, living under false names, or vanishing entirely, the pattern was always the same. True followers of the Dark Lord lived as ghosts, feared but never truly free. To join him was to disappear, and that was the only rule that lasted. Number 23. Do not ask about the mission's purpose. In the shadowed hierarchy of Voldemort's inner circle, one unspoken law towered above the rest. Do not question the mission. This was not merely a suggestion, but a foundational truth drilled into every Death Eater from the moment they pledged allegiance. The Dark Lord, enigmatic and cruel, did not reward curiosity. His commands were not to be dissected, debated, or even slightly doubted. For those who followed him, obedience was not a virtue, it was the only currency that mattered. Lucius Malfoy learned this in the most painful way, his status and influence crumbling the moment he faltered in silent execution. When the plan to retrieve the prophecy from the Department of Mysteries fell apart, Lucius wasn't only punished for failure, he was punished for not understanding that the mission's purpose was not his concern. Bellatrix Lestrange understood this rule intimately. Her loyalty was near religious, a feverish worship that left no room for interpretation. When Voldemort tasked her with guarding Draco during his year at Hogwarts, she didn't ask why a schoolboy was given such a heavy burden. She didn't ask why Snape, whom she despised, was placed so close to the operation. The Dark Lord has his reasons, was all she needed. She obeyed with blind, almost sacred devotion. To question was to challenge, and to challenge was to die. Even when she sensed the insanity of the task, even when Narcissa begged for answers, Bellatrix refused to demand clarity from her master. That silence, that dangerous reverence, made her Voldemort's most trusted weapon. The psychology behind this cult-like obedience stemmed from Voldemort's belief in his own superiority. To him, his Death Eaters were tools, nothing more. They were hammers to drive in nails, not architects to discuss blueprints. There is no good and evil, he once declared, only power and those too weak to seek it. Within that philosophy lay the seed of his command system. Power was not shared, strategy was not explained. Even when the task seemed absurd or counterproductive, the faithful were expected to act without question. The moment a Death Eater tried to reason or express doubt, their value plummeted. Regulus Black discovered this when he dared question the logic behind the Locket Horcrux mission. His disobedience sealed his fate, even though he carried out the mission in secret and died a quiet death in the name of redemption. Voldemort's fear of disobedience was rooted in his deep paranoia. He trusted no one, not truly. Even Snape, his most valuable asset, was never free from suspicion. The secrecy surrounding missions was a tactic as much as a philosophy. If no one knew the full plan, then no one could betray it. When Barty Crouch Jr. infiltrated Hogwarts as Mad-Eye Moody, he knew not to ask why Voldemort needed Harry Potter transported to a specific graveyard on a specific date. He was merely told to put Harry's name in the Goblet of Fire to ensure he reached the Triwizard Cup. The rest of the plan was deliberately hidden. Crouch followed orders not because he understood, but because he knew his life depended on blind execution. Even in moments of confusion, the rule held firm. When Fenrir Greyback was ordered to attack the burrow, he did not ask what the purpose was. The attack had no strategic value. It didn't kill Harry Potter or capture a valuable Order member, but Voldemort had commanded it, and that was enough. The purpose, as always, remained in shadows. Perhaps it was a distraction. Perhaps it was psychological warfare. Perhaps it was simply a test. But Greyback did not need to know. He was a beast, and Voldemort knew how to use beasts through fear and hunger, never through explanation. Snape's role added complexity to this rule. As a double agent, he was often the recipient of vague orders. Voldemort never fully trusted him, yet gave him missions whose logic was wrapped in layers of ambiguity. The most painful example came when Snape was told to protect Draco and to be ready to kill Dumbledore if necessary. He did not ask why Draco was chosen. He did not demand to know how Dumbledore's death fit into the larger plan. "You must be the one to kill me, Severus," Dumbledore whispered in their final conversation. But Voldemort's instructions were cold, emotionless, and final. To carry them out required a detachment from morality and an abandonment of personal understanding. The Death Eaters operated like a machine, each cog unaware of the full mechanism. This was by design. When Rookwood, a former unspeakable, returned to Voldemort's ranks, he was never told why certain magical artifacts were being sought. He was told what to retrieve, whom to contact, but never what the larger picture was. This lack of information wasn't a flaw, it was a safety measure. If captured, a Death Eater could reveal little. If questioned, they could only recount actions, not intentions. Voldemort's genius lay in this fragmentation. Every loyalist was blind to the grand design, seeing only the piece they were forced to carry. Dolohov, brutal and loyal, was sent on raids that seemed to target random magical families. He never asked why, he simply acted. In one mission he tortured a wizard with no ties to the Order, no known alliance with Dumbledore. The reasoning, unknown even to Dolohov, was a pattern Voldemort was testing, a way to provoke the Ministry into reaction. But Dolohov didn't know that. He was told to act, and he acted. That was what separated true servants from liabilities. Voldemort valued power and control, not insight and suggestion. The faithful acted in silence, the uncertain were disposed of. This philosophy extended even to those closest to Voldemort. When Yaxley was placed in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he was never given long-term strategy. His orders came in whispers, specific and immediate. One day, it was to stall an aura. Another, it was to erase records. Never once was the full objective discussed. Voldemort treated information like a poison, dangerous in the wrong hands, effective only when tightly contained. "The Dark Lord does not need to explain himself," Yaxley once said in a private meeting. That sentence defined the very nature of Voldemort's dominion. Even Peter Pettigrew, perhaps the most pitiful of the inner circle, obeyed without understanding. He kept Nagini, he monitored the Riddle House, he assisted in the ritual that resurrected Voldemort. Never once did he ask about Horcruxes. Never once was he told that the snake he was tending was part of his master's soul. "Wormtail, come closer," Voldemort said, and that was enough. Pettigrew obeyed. When his loyalty wavered, his life was taken by the very hand he had given to his master. There was no room for hesitation. There was no space for questions. The rule shaped the entire culture of the Death Eaters. It fostered fear, loyalty, and a kind of twisted faith. Missions were not to be understood, they were to be executed. The unknown became sacred, the unexplained a test of devotion. "He commands, we obey," was the silent motto etched into every meeting, every raid, every whispered plot. The less a Death Eater knew, the safer they were, but also the more expendable they became. That paradox was part of Voldemort's cruelty. You could only survive by being useful, but you could never know enough to be safe. Even Draco Malfoy, a child thrust into this brutal system, learned quickly the cost of asking too much. When he faltered in his mission to kill Dumbledore, he wasn't punished immediately, but he was watched. Bellatrix's eyes followed him constantly, waiting for signs of betrayal. Voldemort, in assigning the boy, had no intention of letting him succeed. The mission was a message, a punishment to Lucius, a lesson to others. But Draco never knew that. He was told to kill, and that was enough. The meaning behind the mission was not his to understand, it was his to suffer. The ultimate expression of this rule was the Horcrux hunt itself. No Death Eater ever asked why Voldemort was so confident in his immortality. No one dared inquire why he fled the moment Harry survived. The truth that Voldemort had split his soul was never spoken aloud. Even those who sensed something unnatural didn't ask. The thought was too dangerous, the knowledge too fatal. Voldemort's obsession with secrecy was not just about strategy, it was about dominance. The fewer questions his servants asked, the more godlike he became in their eyes. To know too much was to challenge that illusion. This culture of silence was Voldemort's strength and his weakness. His refusal to share his vision created a fortress of obedience, but also a wall of ignorance. When his enemies adapted, his followers could not. When plans failed, no one could improve them. They didn't know how, they weren't allowed to think. They were instruments, and instruments do not ask why, they act, and then they break. Number 24. Use unforgivable curses without hesitation. Bellatrix Lestrange was the embodiment of what Voldemort demanded from his followers, cold, merciless, and utterly devoted to the darkness. Her eyes never flickered when she cast the Cruciatus curse, even on her own family. It was not just a skill, it was a belief system. Voldemort's Death Eaters were not simply fighters in a war, they were reflections of a doctrine that mercy was weakness and hesitation was treason. This belief was cemented into the ranks of the Death Eaters from the moment a new recruit was marked. The Dark Lord did not need servants who could wield power, he needed ones who would do so without remorse. The unforgivable curses were more than tools, they were tests of loyalty, proof of ideology, and instruments of purification. Voldemort taught them that hesitation could kill faster than any spell. It was not uncommon during the First War to see new initiates frozen in the face of their first real target. Some paused, looking into the eyes of their victim, seeking some last-minute excuse to justify the horror. These were the ones Voldemort watched closely. He believed that true power was not merely in the wand, but in the will behind it. He could sense doubt, and he crushed it. Evan Rosier had once flinched, only slightly, before torturing an Aura's daughter. He had not lived to make that mistake a second time. Voldemort considered emotional hesitation a disease, and those infected were eradicated with surgical precision. The three unforgivable curses, Avada Kedavra, Cruciatus, and Imperius, each served a different function within the Death Eater hierarchy, but all shared a central requirement. The caster must mean it. Barty Crouch Jr., masquerading as Mad-Eye Moody, taught this very lesson at Hogwarts, stating plainly, "You have to mean them, Potter. You really have to hate." The Dark Lord's most trusted knew that emotional conviction was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was the barrier between success and disgrace, between ascending in the ranks or becoming a cautionary tale. The curse itself was not enough. Voldemort demanded that his followers embody the philosophy behind the spell. One of the clearest examples of this rule in action is the case of Regulus Black. Though never confirmed as a full Death Eater by the Ministry, it is known he bore the Dark Mark. Regulus, raised with the pure-blood supremacy ideology, initially admired Voldemort's vision. But when he witnessed the Dark Lord's treatment of Kreacher, forcing the elf to test a potion designed to torture, Regulus's conviction cracked. That moment of emotional revolt was his doom. He turned against Voldemort, and though he died trying to sabotage him, in the Dark Lord's eyes, he had already failed the test. Compassion, even toward a creature as lowly as a house elf, was proof that Regulus lacked the required coldness. Voldemort would never have allowed such sentiment to survive in his ranks. Alecto and Amicus Caro were cut from different cloth. They took to the unforgivable curses with glee, especially during their time at Hogwarts when the school had become a shadow of its former self under the Dark Lord's control. Amicus would routinely use the Cruciatus curse on students as punishment. Alecto preferred Imperius, bending young minds for re-education. To them, these spells were more than weapons, they were statements of dominance. Their joy in casting them made them valuable in Voldemort's eyes. It wasn't just that they were effective, it was that they enjoyed it. And joy in cruelty was as close to faith as a Death Eater could get. But not all followers were born monsters. Some became them through conditioning. Draco Malfoy stands as a complex figure in this dynamic. Given a task that required not just participation in evil, but complete surrender to it, Draco was supposed to kill Dumbledore. The act required an Avada Kedavra, cold, swift, and without empathy. But Draco hesitated. He lowered his wand. He trembled. He cried. Though he had let Death Eaters into the school and nearly murdered Katie Bell and Ron Weasley through cursed objects when it came to the final moment, he couldn't do it. That failure to Voldemort was not only embarrassing, it was dangerous. It meant Draco could not be trusted. The boy had failed to internalize the one rule that defined Voldemort's vision: never hesitate. The philosophy extended beyond spells and into behavior. Voldemort's entire ideology depended on followers who saw themselves as predators, not participants. Even within their own circle, weakness was preyed upon. Peter Pettigrew, though useful, was constantly belittled because he lacked that inner hardness. He cast spells out of fear, not belief. When he failed to kill Harry in Malfoy Manor and hesitated because of a fleeting moment of mercy, the magical hand Voldemort had given him turned against its master. This wasn't simply poetic justice, it was a final lesson. The Dark Lord had embedded cruelty into the very fabric of his gifts. Pettigrew's hesitation cost him his life, and Voldemort didn't need to lift a finger. This doctrine created a culture of internal competition. Death Eaters sought to outdo each other in loyalty and brutality. During the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, Bellatrix taunted Harry with words that summed up Voldemort's ethos. "You need to mean them, Potter. You need to really want to cause pain." Her laugh as she tortured Sirius emotionally and Neville's parents physically was more than sadism. It was spiritual alignment with the Dark Lord's creed. Her strength was not just in skill, but in the fact that she believed wholeheartedly in the righteousness of domination through fear. The use of unforgivable curses was Voldemort's version of a sacrament. The first time a recruit cast Crucio and felt the rush of power, the transformation began. Voldemort watched those moments with the eye of a high priest. If the spell faltered, if the victim merely gasped instead of screaming, it was because the caster's heart wasn't in it. That, to him, was betrayal. A half-hearted curse was a betrayal of the vision. Voldemort needed absolute commitment, not just obedience but conviction. To be unsure was to be expendable. Perhaps the cruelest example of this indoctrination was seen with Fenrir Greyback. Though technically not branded as a Death Eater, he was regularly employed by Voldemort. Greyback used no spells at all, but his behavior, biting children, maiming innocents, represented the same philosophy. Voldemort valued him because he never hesitated. Greyback's savagery, unrestrained and unapologetic, made him an honorary Death Eater in spirit. This shows that Voldemort's rule extended even to those outside his formal ranks. Unwavering cruelty was the only entry requirement. The unforgivable curses also served as a form of ideological purification. By forcing followers to perform acts they could never take back, Voldemort severed their return to morality. Once you've murdered with Avada Kedavra, once you've broken a mind with Crucio, you are changed. That transformation was intentional. Voldemort understood that guilt could be a tether, so he cut it early. Those who could not cast without trembling were either discarded or broken. In this sense, the curses were not just tools of power, but chains that bound his followers to him forever. There is a reason why Voldemort never used standard spells in battle. He never said Expelliarmus. He scoffed at disarming. "There is no good and evil, there is only power, and those too weak to seek it," he once told Harry in the Chamber of Secrets. Every unforgivable curse he cast was a declaration. To him, moral limitations were inventions of the powerless. The curses were symbols of freedom from weakness, badges of supremacy. Those who failed to adopt this view were seen as contaminated by the disease of human decency. Even Snape, whose loyalties were never simple, mastered the unforgivable curses. He used them with the precision of a man who had trained his emotions into silence. Dumbledore himself asked Snape to use Avada Kedavra, not because he doubted Snape's abilities, but because he knew Snape would do it without error, without faltering. That ability to kill with clean conviction is what Voldemort prized most. It is what made Snape's defection all the more dangerous. He could walk among Death Eaters because he had learned the rule and could mimic it perfectly. In the final days of the war, this rule became even more absolute. The Battle of Hogwarts was not just a fight for territory, but a final exam of belief. Voldemort walked among the bodies of the fallen, examining not just outcomes but methods. He trusted only those who showed joy in conquest and contempt for the weak. The curses flew thick through the air like a storm of pure will. Those who hesitated, like Narcissa Malfoy, risked everything. Her lie to the Dark Lord, telling him Harry was dead, was an act of motherly love, the antithesis of Voldemort's doctrine. He never saw it coming because he had blinded himself to the possibility of empathy, and so the rule remained unspoken but absolute. If you are to follow the Dark Lord, you must kill with a quiet heart, torture with steady hands, and control with unblinking certainty. The spell must be second nature, the pain of the victim an afterthought. Anything less was treason, anything less was death. Number 25. Keep secrets even under torture. The rule was simple, brutal, and absolute. A Death Eater must never speak under torture. It was not a suggestion. It was not an ideal. It was a law etched not in parchment, but in blood and fear. Those who followed the Dark Lord knew it well. Secrets were sacred. Secrets meant survival. And those who whispered, even in agony, were not just traitors. They were already dead. Lord Voldemort demanded silence, and in the shadows of his dominion, silence was a virtue stronger than loyalty itself. For to betray with the tongue was to invite a fate far worse than any prison. Bellatrix Lestrange was the model of this law. Her madness was terrifying, but it was also purposeful. Captured after the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom, she had faced Azkaban without blinking. Even behind the bars, with Dementors gnawing at the edges of her sanity, she held firm. She never broke, she never begged. Her loyalty, sealed with a scream that turned into laughter, became a whispered legend among the Death Eaters. Voldemort rewarded her not with mercy, but with deeper favor. She had proven herself not only mad, but worthy, one who could hold darkness inside without spilling a drop of it. "The Dark Lord will rise again," she had cried. In the courtroom, not as a confession, but as a prophecy. And when he did, he welcomed her back, not as a failure, but as a disciple made holy through suffering. Every initiate into the Death Eaters underwent tests. The Dark Mark was only the beginning. Pain, illusion, deprivation, these were the tools used to shape the mind into a fortress. The training was unspeakable. In the hidden places where Voldemort built his army, recruits were starved, hexed, and made to relive their worst memories. Occlumency was taught not only to protect against magical intrusion, but to break the natural human instinct to scream. Screaming, after all, led to confession, and confession was death. Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange, like Bellatrix, endured their training with grim silence. They were taught that truth was a weapon wielded only by the enemy. Voldemort had no interest in martyrs who cracked under pressure. When Augustus Rookwood was imprisoned in Azkaban after being exposed as a spy in the Department of Mysteries, his usefulness ended the moment he was caught. He said little, but it was enough. Snape once spoke of Rookwood with disdain. He whispered, and that was enough to lose his master's ear forever. In the language of Voldemort, even a whisper was betrayal. And there would be no forgiveness. Death Eaters who survived interrogation but spilled secrets were never rescued. They were executed by their own, quietly, efficiently, and without trial. The most brutal example was Mulciber. Once a skilled enforcer of Voldemort's will, he had fallen into Ministry hands during the First War. Rumors said he had withstood Veritaserum, resisted Legilimency, but when the Dark Lord returned, he refused to allow Mulciber back into the inner circle. Why? Because Voldemort did not trust those who had been caught and lived. Even silence was not enough. Survival, in itself, raised suspicion. "He has tasted fear," Voldemort was said to have muttered, "and fear is a door through which weakness walks." Mulciber died soon after in a failed mission. Some say the mission was meant to fail. There were times when even the most devoted were tested beyond endurance. Barty Crouch Jr. endured years in Azkaban under Polyjuice Potion, concealed by his father's cruelty. When he escaped, he didn't seek freedom. He returned to Voldemort. Even then, Voldemort treated him as a broken tool, not to be trusted with planning, but useful as a pawn. Crouch had never spoken, but he had been hidden. That was enough to stain his loyalty. The Dark Lord viewed silence not as an act, but as a performance, to be proved again and again. Lucius Malfoy, though never captured in the First War, exemplified another kind of failure. When the prophecy remained elusive and the Department of Mysteries was breached, he was imprisoned at last. He did not speak, but his disgrace was not in what he said, it was in what he failed to do. Voldemort's wrath was absolute. Upon Lucius's release after the Ministry's fall, he was stripped of all influence. His punishment was not death, but humiliation. Narcissa's eventual betrayal, though masked in maternal instinct, was rooted in this collapse of favour. The Malfoys had tasted defeat, and Voldemort could smell it. The training for silence was not merely physical, it was philosophical. Death Eaters were taught that pain was illusion, that flesh was weakness, that truth once spoken could never be recalled. Even when tortured by the Cruciatus curse, they were expected to resist. When the Ministry began experimenting with magical truth serums, Voldemort responded by cursing his followers with protections so invasive, so embedded, that some died rather than reveal anything. There were enchantments placed upon the minds of the inner circle, curses that twisted memory, bound tongues, or in the worst cases turned thoughts to ash. Peter Pettigrew was a living example of everything a Death Eater must not become. His cowardice, his panic, his desperation to survive. These made him useful only as long as he obeyed. He was never trusted with real secrets, only errands and errands of the lowest kind. Voldemort once allowed him to stay alive because his betrayal of the Potters had been useful. But even then the Dark Lord made it clear Pettigrew would never rise. His hand, silver and magical, was given not as a gift but as a leash. When the time came, that very hand turned on him. It choked him to death, not because he revealed anything, but because he hesitated to kill when ordered. Hesitation, too, was treason. The true Death Eater was one who died before revealing a single syllable. This is why, during the Second Wizarding War, so many of Voldemort's agents carried poison, cursed amulets, or even self-destructing charms. If captured, they were expected to die on the spot. One nameless operative, suspected of arranging the attack on the Brockdale Bridge, was caught by a squad of Aurors. Before he could be questioned, his body turned to flame. The Ministry never found out who he was. Voldemort never had to reprimand anyone. Dolohov's capture was another warning. Sentenced to Azkaban for multiple murders, he was broken out by Voldemort's forces during the mass escape. He had spoken nothing, despite years behind bars. That silence earned him a second chance, but even then he was watched. Dolohov, loyal and efficient, knew that the only reason he lived was because he had become a ghost, a man without words, without weakness, and without past. When he faced off against Remus Lupin in the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, he fought not for redemption, but for the right to remain among the living. Severus Snape, though not a true Death Eater by the end, embodied the most dangerous kind of silence, the double silence. Trusted by Voldemort as a spy, trusted by Dumbledore as an agent, he spoke to neither side more than he had to. His ability to lie under veritaserum, to shield his mind from even the most skilled legilimens, was a product not only of skill but of trauma. Snape's survival was built on his absolute understanding of Voldemort's rule: never confess. Not even to those you love. Especially not to them. The rule reached its pinnacle in the final days of the war. As Voldemort grew more paranoid, his demands for secrecy intensified. He no longer trusted even his closest allies. He demanded oaths sealed with blood, curses that would kill if any word was spoken aloud. By the time the Battle of Hogwarts began, his inner circle had shrunk, not due to death, but due to doubt. Silence was not merely expected, it was enforced by magic, by fear, by ritual. The Death Eaters who stood at his side were not the most loyal, nor the most powerful. They were the quietest. In the end, it was silence that failed him. The prophecy was spoken. The secret of the Elder Wand was revealed. Narcissa lied. Snape lied. Even the walls of silence he had built around himself began to crack. But the rule remained. It lived on in the shadows, even after Voldemort fell. His surviving followers, those who escaped, kept their tongues still. They vanished into darkness. The Ministry hunted them, but most were never found. The deepest secrets of the Dark Lord died with those who refused to speak. For in the end, silence was not a virtue. It was a weapon, and Voldemort wielded it to the grave. Number 26, respect Nagini. In the darkest corners of Voldemort's world, fear was currency, but respect was sacred, and no rule among the Death Eaters was more sacred than the unspoken commandment, respect Nagini. She was not merely a snake, slithering silently beside the Dark Lord. She was an extension of his being, a vessel of his soul, and in some cases a deadly executioner. To regard her with anything less than reverence was to court death itself. Every Death Eater knew this. Bellatrix Lestrange with her gleaming eyes, Lucius Malfoy with his trembling hands, even Severus Snape behind his icy mask. In their world, Nagini was not an animal, she was a living commandment of loyalty. There was a moment during the Second Wizarding War, deep within Malfoy Manor, when the true weight of this unspoken law became terrifyingly real. When Charity Burbage dangled helplessly in the air, pleading with tears for her life, Voldemort didn't raise his wand. He turned with cold detachment and said the words that sealed her fate. Nagini, dinner. No wand needed, no dramatic duel, just the slow, deliberate action of a creature whose power was equal to any wand. The Death Eaters watched silently as the snake performed her master's will. They didn't flinch, they didn't blink, they didn't dare. Nagini became a permanent presence in Voldemort's inner circle, always near, always watching. She was curled beside him in the shadows of the Riddle House, slithering silently behind him in the corridors of the Ministry, and resting across his lap during the most secret of meetings. For many Death Eaters, it became difficult to know whether the Dark Lord's eyes or Nagini's unblinking stare was more terrifying. When she was present, every Death Eater chose their words carefully, lowered their gaze, and measured their breath, because when Voldemort did not speak, Nagini watched. Even those who were not loyal by choice, such as Draco Malfoy or Peter Pettigrew, knew better than to make a wrong move in Nagini's presence. Peter, who owed his life to Voldemort's twisted mercy, once made the mistake of flinching when Nagini brushed past his ankle. The Dark Lord did not need to speak. Peter bowed his head, stammering apologies not to Voldemort, but to the snake, because in that moment he understood that disrespect toward her was disrespect toward him. She was sacred, and even the coward knew it. The reverence extended even to rituals. When Voldemort returned to a physical form in the graveyard at Little Hangleton, the wand movements, the blood, the bone, it all built toward a moment of rebirth. But Nagini had been there all along. She was the only constant from his phantom state to his return as a full being. She guarded him when he was weakest, followed him through the darkest shadows of Albania, and coiled protectively around his temporary body. Barty Crouch Jr., impersonating Moody, later whispered to Snape that she had never left her master's side. She was the Dark Lord's most loyal companion. There was no rule book among Death Eaters, no official code, but this law, to respect Nagini, was as firm as any written decree. When Voldemort moved into the headquarters at Malfoy Manor, he placed Nagini above even his human followers. She slithered over maps of battle strategies, rested near the fireplace during punishments, and slept near him at night. When Yaxley dared suggest that the snake should be caged during meetings, Voldemort's cold silence was answer enough. The next day, Yaxley's left arm bore a scar, thin and precise, a reminder delivered not by a wand, but by fangs. Nagini was not always present to kill. Sometimes her power was in what she represented, the silent possibility of death. During one particularly tense meeting, when Voldemort suspected a spy among his followers, Nagini slithered slowly between the seated Death Eaters. No one moved. Her presence was the interrogation. She needed no questions, no threats. Just the subtle brush of her scales against fabric was enough to pull confessions from trembling lips. She embodied the terror of silence. She was justice, punishment, and witness. Bellatrix Lestrange, who prided herself on being Voldemort's most loyal servant, never dared touch the snake, not even she. Her eyes followed Nagini with the same awe and dread as she gave her master. In private, she once confessed to Narcissa that Nagini was more than alive, that she carried part of him within her. Though she never used the word Horcrux, she knew something ancient dwelled within the Serpent, something inviolable. To strike at Nagini would be to strike at the Dark Lord's essence. During the Battle of Hogwarts, the rule became prophecy. As Voldemort grew more unstable, more desperate, Nagini became his final sanctuary. He placed her in a protective sphere, carried her beside him like a final heartbeat. "You are still loyal," he whispered, according to Severus Snape's final memories. "You will stay close." That moment, tragic and twisted, revealed the truth. Voldemort trusted Nagini more than he trusted any man, woman, or ghost. She was the only one he shielded, not out of affection, but because she was part of him, his only remaining Horcrux. The fact that Neville Longbottom, not Harry, delivered the final blow to Nagini was poetic in its rebellion. Neville, the boy who had lost everything to Voldemort, raised the sword of Gryffindor and severed not just the Serpent, but the last symbol of Voldemort's supremacy. In that moment he wasn't just killing a snake, he was challenging the sacred, breaking the commandment, destroying the Dark Lord's most protected relic. The ground shook, and Voldemort screamed, not because of pain, but because part of his soul had been ripped away before his eyes. The spell had been broken. Nagini's death was more than strategic. It was emotional. It fractured something ancient and ritualistic among the Death Eaters. For years they had revered her, obeyed the rule without questioning it. Her presence was a comfort to them, not out of love, but certainty. She was the spine of the Order. When she fell, so too did the final structure of Voldemort's world. The snake that once delivered punishment now lay lifeless on the battlefield, her head separated from her body. The silence that followed was not of shock, but of recognition. The rule had been shattered. No other animal, magical or mundane, had ever held such symbolic power among wizards. Dragons were feared, hippogriffs respected, thestrals misunderstood, but Nagini, she was revered, not for her species, but for her role. She was the last priestess of Voldemort's cult. She moved among them like a god's avatar, blessing some, condemning others. Every Death Eater, from Crabbe to Avery, had a memory of her, and each memory was linked to a lesson learned in fear. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was a prophecy of pain. In Voldemort's final days, when paranoia consumed him, he held Nagini close like a sacred relic. He trusted no one, and yet he whispered to her in Parseltongue, letting only the snake hear his darkest thoughts. She was his only confidant. Not Bellatrix, not Snape, not even his own image in the mirror. Just the snake who never betrayed, never questioned, never judged. She became his mirror, his reflection without fear. When she was gone, he was truly alone, naked, mortal, and weak. The rule to respect Nagini had shaped the culture of fear among Death Eaters. It was not enforced with punishment, but by tradition, awe, and survival instinct. Nagini was the line between service and damnation. To treat her with disrespect, to mock her, question her presence, or underestimate her, was to invite annihilation. Even Dolores Umbridge, when she saw Nagini once in a hidden corridor, bowed her head slightly. She had never met the Serpent officially, but instinctively understood. This creature was beyond titles and ranks. This creature was law. In the end, Voldemort's greatest mistake was not hiding Nagini, but loving her too much. In his obsession to protect her, he exposed his vulnerability. The rule he imposed in that Nagini must be respected became the thread that unraveled him. For all the power, the spells, the terror he wielded, it was a boy with a sword and a heart full of defiance who proved that rules, even sacred ones, can be broken. And when they break, even the darkest kings fall. Number 27. Do not seek forgiveness. Lucius Malfoy stood in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor, pale even by his usual standards, clutching his wand as if it might vanish. Bellatrix Lestrange watched him with barely hidden contempt, her eyes gleaming with something close to hunger. The Dark Lord had summoned them both, and the silence in the room was more menacing than any scream. Lucius knew why. He had failed. He had allowed the prophecy to slip through his fingers, and worse, he had lost the diary, a precious fragment of his master's soul, without even understanding what it was. In any other army, he might have begged forgiveness, pled his case, explained his reasoning. But not here. Not in the world Voldemort created. Here, failure had only one path, pain or death. Bellatrix never asked for forgiveness. She never admitted to failure, because the moment one did, one declared weakness, and Voldemort abhorred weakness more than treason. When she escaped from Azkaban after 14 years, her mind fractured but her loyalty intact, she returned not as a victim, but as a disciple. Her devotion had earned her the Dark Lord's approval, not pity. That was the paradox of Voldemort's followers. The deeper the suffering they endured without complaint, the more they proved their worth. The unspoken rule among Death Eaters was simple and absolute. Never beg, never weep, never explain. Repentance was a word for fools like Snape, who played both sides. For the true followers, atonement could only be bought with blood. Regulus Black once believed in Voldemort's vision. Young, idealistic, hungry for purpose, he joined the Death Eaters with the fire of belief. But when he discovered the truth behind the locket, the ritual, and the cost of the Horcrux, he broke the rule. He tried to undo his mistake, to act from conscience. He turned against Voldemort, not with words, but with a secret rebellion. He died alone, unremembered, without a grave. There was no redemption for him in Voldemort's eyes, no posthumous forgiveness. His name vanished from the ranks, and with it, any possibility of mercy. Those who turned away were not forgiven. They were erased. Forgiveness, in the ideology of Voldemort, was weakness masquerading as virtue. It was a privilege of those who feared confrontation, those who sought harmony over power. That was Dumbledore's language, not his. As Voldemort said in the graveyard, there is no good and evil, there is only power and those too weak to seek it. In that twisted philosophy, seeking forgiveness meant admitting that one had acted against strength, against dominance. It meant accepting the framework of morality. That was intolerable. The only morality Voldemort recognized was survival through supremacy. If you failed, you proved yourself unworthy. If you apologized, you made it worse. Peter Pettigrew's trembling hands and tearful eyes did not inspire Voldemort's pity, even after Wormtail brought him back to life. He was used, but never trusted. "Wormtail here has a debt to repay me," Voldemort said coldly, and that was all the warmth Pettigrew ever received. When he showed a moment of hesitation trying to resist the Dark Lord's command to kill Harry, the silver hand, a gift from Voldemort himself, turned against its owner and strangled him. Even loyalty wasn't enough if it was mixed with cowardice. Pettigrew's final sin wasn't betrayal, it was seeking forgiveness without the strength to back it. In that moment he violated the deepest rule of the Death Eaters: never regret. Draco Malfoy learned this rule the hard way. Thrust into a role he wasn't ready for, asked to kill Dumbledore, he faltered. He hesitated, and the consequences weren't immediate, but they were permanent. Voldemort didn't punish him openly. He didn't need to. He invaded the boy's home, humiliated his father, turned his mother into a pawn, and made the manor a public stage for executions. In Voldemort's world, failing once meant eternal suspicion. You didn't get to explain, you didn't get to recover. You lived in the shadows, under the gaze of someone who might erase you with a whisper. Even Severus Snape, the most cunning of Voldemort's followers, understood the danger of showing remorse. His entire life was a balancing act, one misstep from destruction. He played the part of the cold, calculating Death Eater, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. When Voldemort returned and sought confirmation of Snape's loyalty, the potions master didn't ask for trust. He offered strategy, results, and effectiveness. "You are a skilled Occlumens, I believe?" Voldemort asked. Snape did not answer with excuses or apologies. He answered with power, because even he knew the moment you ask for mercy, you sign your own execution.